Hey everyone, it's the system here. Going to be doing a video on false realities and how those can be used for control in TBMC settings. Well, the uses within TBMC within the TBMC organization see for false realities, and so obviously, and of course, major one is control, but it's not alone. Well, most of it's control in some form, but there's often a desire to create a dependency within a set of headmates for the organization is another common use. There's obviously control in various forms. There's interjection of specific characters deliberately, right? The reasons mostly related to the uglier side of things in terms of sexual desire, that sort of thing, but it can be for mindsets or loyalties, that sort of thing as well. There's also destabilization reasons and identification reasons. The how comes down to, I mean, in many ways it comes down to just acting out those falsehoods in some way, right? You know, the easy example is rather than just kidnapping a child and doing whatever you want, you instead act out an alien abduction, right? So it's not just, oh, there's someone being kidnapped and tortured. It's, oh yeah, you've been kidnapped by aliens. Aliens have taken you and are experimenting on you. You know, similar effect in many ways, but it has benefits regarding, that's something I forgot to mention earlier, believability, right? People are less believable when they talk about things that, like aliens or satanic stuff, anything outside of what most people perceive as reality, right? If you talk about things outside of that, people aren't going to believe you, regardless of whether or not that was your perceived reality at the time, right? Regardless of whether or not that is, for all intents and purposes, what you went through. People aren't going to believe you on that ever, and they're going to then dismiss the rest of your story as well over it. Yeah, VR is another common choice in terms of getting people to believe things they wouldn't necessarily naturally. It's, you know, getting better all the time and more efficient at that. So it's not perfect by any means, but you know, it can provide some level of falsehood and false reality, and so will be used for that. Obviously, there can be shells who help filter perception to help create a specific sense of reality. That's a relatively common option. Not always the case, but you know, it's relatively common, so one to watch out for if you can. Yeah, there's often shells are more useful for the longer term falsehoods and ones that are further from reality, right? Because it's much more energy intensive to maintain a falsehood that is rather more permanent, or that's rather long term and further and has more things pointing against it, right? There's more to filter out, there's more to write off and ignore as not important right? And is not to not affect that reality perception. So of course, shells become more useful for that because they're better able to do that in the long term. Not the only way to do it, but a good example of well, not necessarily a good example, but an example of a falsehood that doesn't necessarily actually require that much false reality, is vampirism. If you want a headmate to believe in that they're a vampire, obviously there's some reality setting in terms of getting the initial false reality set up, which will probably involve some sort of turning ritual with a near-death experience involved. That tends to be how those go. It tends to be how they work. There are probably some which don't involve near-death experiences, or there are other ways of getting the initial set up other than taking a human headmate and doing that to them. But that's a relatively common one. Then the other major thing is simply just controlling nourishment for that headmate, right? Ensuring that they only feel full and satisfied when they've drank, right? And of course, that can be done simply through direct control of food intake, water intake, all of that, and ensure that the only time that headmate gets to be in a full body is after drinking. That's, one option. The other option is to have some filtration of, or modification of what's being perceived by the body to either fake hunger or fake satisfaction, depending on what you want at a given time. These can and often are done in tandem, but they are also often done on their own, right? It's very variable, right? It depends a lot on the organization doing it and on the victim specifically, and how important the vampirism being a permanent thing is as well, right? But especially in systems where they don't split a lot naturally, you try and shell headmates are kept for the most important tasks, for example, right? Which often this is not, because it can be maintained without, so it tends to be left as a without, but of course it's very variable. Okay, so the big, as has been titled here, the big false reality, right? The important one for maintenance is the idea of a safe life, right? In that you need the organization feels the need, and the organization need for there to be a host, a safe life host who can't see that the body is in danger, right? Who doesn't understand the risks that are inherent to life currently, and as such is not, despite the fact that, and obviously has a major amount of control of whether or not the body's getting out, because the safe life, even if it's only 30-40% of the time that body is around, that's the 34% of the time where you're interacting with the outside world, which is where you're going to get out from is from the outside world. So, of course, having that 30-40% of safe life be working towards escape is incredibly beneficial. It's not a requirement for escape, but it helps a lot. So, having safe life believe there is no reason to work towards escape is obviously something that organizations will work towards, and is obviously quite a major false reality to maintain, because it's completely false, right? There is no truth there whatsoever. Even your safe life host isn't safe, right? Even your safe life isn't safe. It's just the danger tends to be less physical and more emotional, although that's variable as well. Yeah. And of course it's difficult to maintain because you also can't let the organization can't let other headmates ever feel safe, right? There are headmates that can never feel safe, so you can't just have a globalized "this is safe" time filter, because that then puts people who you need to be in a constant state of fear into a belief that they're safe, which is undesirable as far as the organization is concerned. So that doesn't work as an option. Obviously, it's a complex one to be put together. It's often mainly then comes down to, as a false reality, one of memory management and dissociation, right? It's a matter of spacing out when danger arrives, dissociating away the trauma responses that you're feeling, and forgetting any information to the contrary of safety, right? And not forgetting, but because the body is still like to hold those memories somewhere. It's just that they stop being accessible to whoever's running safe life at that time, or whoever's it's not always a single host, but part of it tends to be ensuring that there's a singlet owner as well. Not always, but it's often people start asking, right, because of how much of plurality is seen as definitively trauma-based, if their safe life hosts start noticing that they're plural, there can then be questions being asked regarding, well, okay, why am I why do I share a head with people? Is this because of trauma? And then questions start being asked about being trauma, and you start to notice the other trauma symptoms more, because a lot of them can be written off until you know they're a trauma symptom, right? They're just some weird quirk until you realise that that's probably a trauma thing, because comparing experiences to other people with trauma. So ideally, you want to maintain the illusion of a single individual. The illusion of a single individual is aimed to be maintained in the safe life, right? Which doesn't work always, but it's attempted. Yeah. Okay. Moving on to destabilization falsehoods. These are falsehoods most commonly implemented in the after escape, right? You've got out, somewhere safer, or no longer under direct threat anymore from the organization, or far less direct threat. Complete safety is likely to be a long time coming, and will almost certainly require working through destabilization stuff to achieve, because that's the kind of the point of destabilization stuff, is to make you less safe once you're trying to get out and get safe. It's not the only reason behind its existence, but it's one of the primary contributing factors to its existence. It also helps serve as a way to limit people's belief of a system's testimony, but the major principle of it is putting someone back in contact. Say, often, if you basically what happens is, a large part of it is making survival difficult enough that the safe life hosts start thinking that maybe they made a mistake and should go back to the safety and regularity of contact, right? Of that danger, because that was a danger that was at least reliable in and left one function, right? And surviving, even if it was distressing and uncomfortable and all of that, right? So the survival was functional, and that tends to be part of the draw. Also, part of it is just obviously, if you start hallucinating, things like that, you're going to start having your memory act weird and remembering things that definitely couldn't have happened. You're going to start questioning whether or not the memories of danger and abuse are real, which means you're going to like to go back because you didn't have to worry about this whilst you were in contact. That's part of it. Obviously, it's often will be a matter of part of it is often just pulling back the things like, there's likely to be pain management headmates, right, who, because most traumatized bodies have some amount of chronic pain or in some form, and so you pull those guys away from front and suddenly the body is in a lot more pain and it's a lot harder to cope with life because you're used to not hurting so much and suddenly everything hurts, right? And you're not used to it, you don't know how to deal with it. And it's like, yeah, okay, no, everything has always hurt like that. It's just the people who've been shunting that away are no longer there to shunt it away, so now having to deal with that directly, can obviously be hallucinations, delusions, messing with memory. It often includes worsening any other mental health or a difficulty somebody suffers with. Obviously, as mentioned, hallucinations, stuff like that, that's much worse for people with, bodies who suffer with schizophrenia, for example, or, schizoaffective, anything where hallucinations would be an expected phenomenon from that, it becomes easier to cause those hallucinations, and they're more, often harder to deal with, more believable, things like that, because of how those work. But that it can be, those can be achieved without, but it's harder and less effective. So obviously seizures are another one that might be caused. There's the major one we've had problems with often is depression spikes, because just, no dopamine now, you don't get it, which is an interesting one, because it's like, how come, like, it feels so, it's so hard to just accept the fact that despite the fact life is better now, it doesn't feel better a lot of the time, just because there's been a lot of the um, a lot of what we were dependent on, the serotonin and so on for in the past, was us, those small slivers of false power given to us by the organization in certain situations, and that of course doesn't happen anymore. And there is no real health, we haven't found a healthy mechanism for gaining those chemicals, those neurotransmitters, so and so on, really ever. And so now we're stuck in a situation where obviously there's still people internally who are scared of the fact that we're, are worried we're going to end up recontact, and if they don't keep fighting for that recontact, they're going to be punished worse and more because they were disloyal, which is understandable and can't fault them too much, but it's not helpful right now. Regardless, they're trying to protect us as best they can and protect themselves as best they can, but it's counterproductive right now, unfortunately, to have people killing our mental stability, right? But it's understandable why that's happening, so no blame to people doing it. It's just difficult for those of us trying to live our life. Yeah. Okay. Introjection through false reality. This is going to either be the introjection of a character or potentially a full setting, right? Often both to some degree, but the common ones are individual characters. Or, it's relatively common for it just to be a single character as well. But it's often both, because that gives you that makes it harder for those characters introduced to realize that they're not truly those characters. Or, okay. To realize that their life is not that of the introduced character and the source. So, obviously there are ways. So, it's often either because there's a skill set and a mindset that's wanted, a way of behaving, or it's because someone sees that character as a way to receive certain gratification of a unpleasant nature, right? It's a reasonably common reason for it, and it's not a pleasant reason. It's not a reason that you have to like or accept, for yourself, but that is often why characters are injected, is because people think they find them to fulfill whatever sick fantasy they have, right? And so, yeah. There's a reasonable amount of media that was deliberately created for this. Not all of it, obviously, but, and not everyone who's been deliberately injected is going to be deliberately injected from media that was created for that purpose, but some media is created for that purpose, so it's perfectly reasonable to want to avoid certain pieces of media. It's reasonable to get sketchy vibes about a piece of media and then start avoiding it. It may well be for good reason. The one example of this sort of interjection style of false reality is also a destabilization one often, in that it's quote unquote Wonderland sets. So, you know, pulling in various characters from Alice in Wonderland, either one of the films or from the books directly. It's not, or it obviously these aren't. Part of this is, of course, you know, amusing behavior patterns, useful behavior patterns, just to complete the feeling of lack of control off that, you know, there are in those books. There's obviously hierarchy and stuff that can be used naturally there. There's obviously a lot of weirdness and stuff that can make someone seem and look crazy if they start talking about, right, especially not, which can help a lot with obviously destabilization and the forced recontact from destabilization through obviously contact with the law and medical stuff is often how forced recontact goes. It's not always the case, but you know. But there's also certain sexual stuff that is seen there, or there's a common one is a desire for Alice for unsavory purposes, and so that's a common use. It's not always Alice either, but that's the most common one because of course it is. You know, hardly surprising. The child from a book written by a paedophile is often drawn on by paedophiles to create victim kids for themselves. Not so, yeah. That's unpleasant to think about and understand entirely what if you don't want to, but it's useful to know about. Another common, obviously we've mentioned skill sets and mindset. You know, there's a reasonable chance that you want someone who's going to quote unquote fight for what's quote unquote right. Pull in someone who's fought for what they believed in, whether that be a heroic or villainous figure, and it can vary. You know, obviously with the heroic figures, you want to there's a lot of false reality around showing that the org are the good people, and then for the more villainous ones, it tends to be a matter of pretending that they can actually get all the power they want and actually hit, you know, that the org is not going to screw that headmate right over again once they get what they want out of them. Although, you know, it's, to be fair, that's often less false reality required for the villain, you know, because they are already more closely aligned and are often going to be more willing to work for someone who would stab on the back because they do the same, right? So, you know, it can work out to some degree better, but doesn't always. Yeah. Okay. Obviously it's easy enough to see how control can be done. With most of those, you know, if someone sees themselves as needing something specific, you know, that's a nice easy way to put some level of control through requirement, right? You need to stay in contact because that's a safe way of getting this thing that you need. Or safest way. It's not safe, but it's less dangerous. Obviously, vampirism, human blood, is an easy example there. It's something Vamp struggles with to some degree. Not hugely, but there are struggles there on that. It can be hard for Vamps to, like, knows that they've eaten enough and drank enough, but doesn't feel like it. Wants that extra thing, needs that extra thing to feel satiated and can't get that. Right. Of course, the other major one in terms of control is the perfect and eternal surveillance, right? The idea that you're always being watched and it's perfectly watched as well. This cannot be true, fortunately, right? That can be falsified effectively for a child, where obviously there's a huge amount of control and knowledge as to where the child is at all times what they're doing, right? That's not difficult to achieve for a younger child, because they can't go out, they can't walk outdoor really on their own, they can't go round to other places, they certainly can't drive away or move out, any of those things. And it's at that point you start putting into place reporter parts who then, you teach them that if they tell the truth about everything that's been going on, that they know has happened, that the body's been doing, then they don't get punished, right? And if they lie, they get punished, and it's always going to be known whether or not they lie. Because, of course, it's always going to be known whether or not they lie, because at that point, those lies are easy enough to pick up on, right? And that's not always going to be the case, but by the time it would be possible for that body to be doing things externally and not be known about, all the reporter parts are so ingrained in the idea that if they lie, they will be hurt, and hurt badly. They're not going to lie, and so, of course, it then self-perpetuates, because as long as you have these two reporter parts, if one of them says the truth, right, and you can tell which one that is, then you can punish the other one for lying, right? Or you even punish both of them, because one of you lied, and you've got to make sure that neither of you lie. How dare one of you lie to us, right? And obviously you want, ideally there's more with greater incentive not to lie, but the basic principle stands from as few as 2 headmates who are reporter parts. It's the same principle, you just scale it up for greater security. Yeah. And the other people who are often seen as needing to believe they're being watched are, of course, internal handlers, because if there's any dissent in the system, they need to believe that it can't be gotten away with, because they have slightly more ability to stop dissent, and it's much simpler for the org's perspective if headmates are stopped by other people in their own head, rather than them having to go in and actively physically punish the body beyond a certain point, right? Now, they might punish the body anyway, but that tends to then be more a matter of sick enjoyment rather than an actual field necessity, right? Of course, that varies and is dependent on a number of factors, but there comes a point generally in any given headmate or any given body's lifespan where externalized punishment is rarely necessary, but it's still often executed just because that punishment is still by external handlers as something enjoyable to do, is something they want to be doing, as a reward almost, right? So that's highly unpleasant to think about, but it's how it is. Anyway, moving on to the final section here. Identification. There's, obviously identification of specific headmates within a body, or of bodies who have been part of certain organizations. This can be an intra-organizational thing where a group of various organizations who are loosely allied, right? They don't have full lists of each. They don't know the full lists of membership from each other. They don't really know much about each other than the fact that there are specific false reality sets implanted in victims of both or all that can be checked for, which helps if with, someone from this org is moving to your area, for whatever reason. It might be a trade reason, it might be trade of knowledge or certain victim types or headmates, things like that. It could just be that it's become untenable for the safe life premise to not move to that area, and by setting up that contact, control can be maintained. And then obviously, so those false realities are then queued out on. They can also be used obviously to look for escapees, right? Because you got that false reality, someone is a victim of one of the orgs that's part of that circle, and so you can then pull them back in, right? Start recontact procedures, and either pull them into your own organization or hand them back, depending. They often depend on scene usefulness, how long ago the escape was, whether or not you can ID which group they were from, how well those two groups within the wider network get on specifically, whether or not there's been a bounty placed for the return, all sorts of things, right? But the basic idea is you can ID the people who are in need of recontacting and recontact them as well. So this, for us, the only one we can ID as having been, there's probably more, but the only one we've noticed is there's a false reality set of a relatively of a semi-religious of a semi-religious nature that we can fall into easily, right? And probably fall into it more completely as well. It's hard to say, as it's been a little bit, and we weren't safe last time that got queued out. So yeah, it has happened to us, but that was back when we were still in contact anyway, so it mattered less. And keep a much more careful eye out now. Haven't noticed anyone queuing out a false reality set on us, but doesn't mean it hasn't happened, just that we haven't noticed it. Hopefully it hasn't happened, and if we notice it happening, we will probably let people know, because obviously it might disrupt a lot of our current activities as well as we scramble for safety again. Yeah, okay, anyway, I think that's everything this video, so catch you all later. System signing out. Hope to catch you all next week. Please do remember to like, subscribe, comment, especially if you got any questions you want answered. Be happy to answer them either in the comments or in another video. So catch you all next week.